Let's have a look today at drawing a lion with coloured pencils. This has to be one of the most popular drawings that I've ever created. And I can see why. He's got a real wow factor. So let's go through the process I used to draw this lion and also generally the method I always use to draw fur. Now before we get started with this drawing, if you do want to draw this with me in a lot more detail, I have a full course available. I will show you everything you need to know in detail to draw this lion. From the exact materials that I'm using to the most important basic techniques and the fur texture method. We then go through the process in detail to create this lion. Now I have not only this lion but loads of other tutorials as well in a whole host of different subject matters. And I have tutorials covering coloured pencil, graphite pencil and watercolour pencils. For each and every one of these tutorials I include really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colours that I'm using, sketch outlines and the reference photo. Some of the tutorials are very complicated like the lion or this as well. And I have some much more basic beginner-friendly tutorials and courses too. Do check out the link in the description. So let's get started on drawing this lion. And I want to start off by building up the base layers. This is the lightest colour I can see in each section. So I'm starting off by particularly focusing on the face and the mouth, and I'm looking for the lightest colour that I can see within the fur. Now I do think the lightest colour on the fur of the face is different to the lightest colour on the mane. Actually the lightest colour on the face I think is a very light grey. So I want to build that up all over the face. I'm not worrying about any sort of texture, any sort of fur texture at this point. I just want to solidly block in some colour. So I am trying to make this as smooth as possible, and you'll see that I am working in circular motions rather than just scribbling back and forth with the pencil. So by building up the pencil in some oval motions, it's just going down in a much smoother way. I also want to be pressing really nice and lightly with the pencil. So you'll see I'm holding the pencil pretty far back, and what that does is literally stops me from being able to press too hard. Because we're going to build up so much colour and texture over the top of this, I don't want to press hard with the pencil because that's just going to make my life impossible. You will notice here that I've got something called a pencil extender. That just means that I can hold the pencil much more comfortably. As my pencils get quite short, it means that they'll last longer. Now I also always want to be working with a sharp pencil. The pencil is going to go down in a far more consistent way if it is sharp. So once I've blocked in this colour on the whole of the face, what I'm then going to do is start looking for the underlying colours. So I often think it helps when looking at a reference photo to squint. That helps you see all of the underlying colours. And we want to focus on building up those underlying colours rather than any of the texture. I kind of think of the base layers as a way that we can get our bearings and work out what needs to go where. Generally, map in all of the shapes and have a good idea of what the lion will look like or what we want it to look like. So I'm going to gradually work from the lighter colours towards the darker colours. So I've started off with that light grey, then I've mapped in quite a light orange. Now I'm moving to a light brown to begin marking in the shape of the eye, also the dots from the whiskers here, and generally any shadows on the face. You can see actually reasonably quickly it is starting to look like a lion's face. It's obviously not looking realistic, but we will get to that. So now I've got something on the face. Let's do exactly the same for the mouth of the lion. So I'm once again looking for the lightest colour I can see in each area. So the lightest colour on the tongue is a very light kind of cartoony pink. The lightest colour on the teeth on the most part is actually brown. The teeth are not as white as you might expect. They're a very dark browny yellowy pink. So I'm going to map in the main shapes with this brown. This is actually the same brown that I used on the face. And I used the same brown to map in the darker areas you can see on the roof of the mouth. So that will eventually need to be a lot darker. But as I say, for now, I just want to get my bearings and work out what's going where. So around the edge of the mouth, that will be a very, very dark brown or black. But the lightest colours that I can see in between some of these dark areas is actually a very light grey. So I'm going to block in this grey all around the mouth. And then once I'm happy with that, I can move on to the next darkest colour. And again, again, still not worrying about the texture, start going over some of these same folds and shadows that I can see on the face, and also using this brown to go all around the mouth. So before I have built up any sort of texture, I have already mapped in the shapes, and actually the face is already looking a lot like a lion. We've certainly got our bearings for now. I really have a good idea on the face on what needs to go where. It's obviously not looking vibrant enough and it's got no texture, but that's okay. So what I now want to do is start thinking about adding in that texture. And what I'm going to do is once again work from the lighter colors towards the darker colors, making some very small flicks on the fur. So the fur on the lion's face is much shorter than on the mane. Therefore, I want to be making much smaller flicks with my pencil. When we move on to the mane, I will want to be making much longer flicks, but I'm literally for now just going to go over the whole of the lion's face with these little flicks with this pencil to begin to build up that texture. Now, beyond getting the length of the flicks correct, so the length of the fur looks correct, I also particularly want to focus on the direction of the fur. The fur isn't all going straight down. In some areas it's pointing up, or maybe curving round, it's going down and to the left hand side here. I want to be following the direction of that fur, and also looking out for any areas that might have slightly longer fur. So around here, for example, the fur is a little bit longer, but it's also curving round. So I want to make some slightly longer curvy flicks. And I'm just going to work through a few different colors, building up these light little flicks with the pencil. It's important to take note that I'm not pressing hard. I want to be gradually building up that texture. And reasonably quickly, we have a much furrier looking face, although I do think it looks a bit scratchy and it's not looking vibrant enough, but that's okay. So I'll just briefly focus on making the darker areas a bit darker. So I've got the black pencil here, and I'm just going to very lightly go over any area that I will want to be very dark. I always think black can look quite harsh, particularly on animals, so I don't want to go in really hard with this pencil. I want to make the area a bit darker, but make it possible that I will be able to add a dark brown over the top of this so that I'm left with a really dark brown rather than a very harsh black. And then I've got something on the face. It's looking pretty detailed, but it's not looking finished. However, before I focus more on the face, I want to do exactly the same process for the mane. I want to get something marked in for the mane, and then I can start looking at the drawing as a whole. So here I'm, in the same way as I did for the face, marking in the lightest color I can see on the mane. So this is kind of a beige color. And you'll see I'm again putting down the color really nice and smoothly, holding the pencil very far back, working in circular motions, and just putting down something over the whole of the main area. And this will give us the background that we can then build up all of the shapes and texture on top of. So now I think it's important to take note of what can be seen within the main fur. It's exactly the same because it's longer fur as drawing hair, for example. All of the fur on the mane is sorted into sections. We're not really drawing individual strands of fur. What we want to do is draw the sections. So if you, when you're looking at the reference photo, kind of squint, you'll see those sections very clearly are showing. With these colors for now, I'm not drawing that texture. I want to draw in the sections. And I'm once again working from the lighter colors towards the darker colors. So this is actually the same kind of orangey color that I used on the lion's face. And I want to use this to just mark in the lighter areas and begin to get my bearings on where these fur clumps are going to go. I can then move on to a light brown, still the same kind of colors that I used on the face, and start marking in some of the darker edges to these sections. Now, I can't stress enough how weird you expect it to look at this point. We're not trying to immediately go from nothing to it looking like a really detailed lion. This is just the base layers to begin to know what's going where. And we can gradually build up all of these colors. So you can see I've really got a lot of the clumps already marked in. In some areas, I've just shaded in nice and lightly, solidly blocked in an area if it's a slightly darker area. There's no point in me trying to mark in all of the shapes in a really dark patch where it's not going to show through at the end. And as I say, I'm working from these lighter colors towards the darker colors. So for every color that I add in, I then want to take a minute to look at the reference photo, think about the next darkest color that I think is missing, add that in, and then I can do the same process again. And as I get towards the really dark areas, I want to be still pressing nice and lightly, but just mapping in the main dark shapes that I can see within the main. And so by the time that I've mapped in all of the base layers for the main, it looks like this. It is roughly looking like a lion, but obviously we haven't got any texture and it's not exactly looking realistic. Let's now at this point begin to build up the fur texture, and it's very much the same process as on the face. So you can see I'm starting here now actually with a darker color. We're going to work from the dark to the light this time, and I'm again just brushing my pencil against the paper to make some really soft and light flicks. So I want to be at all times looking at the direction of the fur. Because this fur is sorted into clumps, into sections, the fur is going all over the place, and I just want to be looking at where that's going and gradually building it up. Now I'm really with this darkest pencil only building up the light flicks in those darkest areas. I can then move on to the next lightest pencil, so this is a reddish brown, and again brush my pencil against the paper in the direction of the fur here, in any area where this is the main color. So this is where a lot of the mane is built up with. This is sienna brown, and you can start to get an idea on exactly how all over the place this mane is in terms of the fur direction. But that's where building up all of these underlying clumps and sections makes it so much easier. We really only need to focus on the sections rather than trying to draw the individual strands of fur. And then I'm just going to keep building up a series of colors, adding to all of this fur texture, and eventually I'm left with something that looks like this. It's looking really, really washed out, but we do have all of that fur built in. So what I now want to do is focus on brightening everything up, and on the most part I'm not really using any more flicking motions. I want to be using circular motions like I did at the very beginning of the drawing to just brighten things up and add in a certain amount of richness. So what I'm going to do is work through this, always comparing my drawing to the reference photo and thinking about the most obvious color that's missing. So for example, now I think the most obvious thing that's missing is that the fur is not looking rich or red enough. So I can just start building up some of this color on top of what I've already got on the mane until it's looking richer and closer to the reference photo. And then I can once again compare my drawing to that reference photo, think about the most obvious color that's missing from here. So now I would say it's missing a kind of orange color. This is the same orange that I used right at the very beginning, but I can just lightly go over the top to brighten this up and add to what I've got here. Again, it needs more brown now, so I can build that up. And you can see how I'm very much still working through those sections and just bit by bit adding to the richness. Now I'm not only focusing on the mane at this point, I'm also focusing on the face. So I want to build up some more darkness around the mouth, for example. That's the most obvious thing that's missing to me at this point. And now that I have built up the edge of the mouth, it makes the tongue look way too light and washed out. It just looks really odd when it looked okay a minute ago. So I do think for every color that I add, it makes the next color that's missing look more obvious. So I can brighten up that tongue, add a bit more purple because it does have a real purple tone to it. And I'm literally just going through this process one step at a time, brightening this up and generally smoothing out the fur. I feel like if you don't build colors over the top when you've built up the texture, it just ends up looking really scratchy and odd. I like adding circular motions. I don't feel it makes you lose all of the underlying fur. It just brightens the colors up but keeps that texture. So I think I spent a lot longer than you might expect adding to the colors and building this up. In some places I am adding flicking motions again, like here for example. You can see I'm just adding a few subtle flicks with this reddish brown. This is a color with this kind of orangey brown. But I think a lot of people stop building up the color, in my opinion, too soon. I think I spent about 2.5 hours building up all of these different colors after I got the initial lion mane shape. So it is very much a process that you just keep building on. But as I get towards the end of the lion and the fur is really starting to look much richer, so at this point I want to start thinking about adding in the whiskers. And to do this, I'm using something called a jelly roll pen. This is a white gel pen that works really well at putting light colors over the top of dark colored pencil in a way that is not possible to do with the white colored pencil. So this is great for adding in the whiskers because obviously they're very wiry. They're not really thin white lines. So I'll just mark in all of these whiskers with the jelly roll pen. And then once it's completely dry, just go over the top of it lightly with a white pencil. I find that smooths it out. And use a darker pencil to add a slight shadow. And then that is the end of this lion. So it's very much a case of building up the base layers, building up all of the key shapes before then adding to it with the texture, all of the fur texture in either little flicks if it's short fur or much longer flicks if it's longer fur, and then building up more color over the top of that fur texture to partly smooth out that texture but also build up the color and the vibrancy. Now remember, if you do want to go through this with me in a lot more detail, it is available on my website. Happy drawing, guys. I'll see you in the next one.